Tenant-friendly lease versus landlord-friendly lease. In this video, I am going to give you a difference between a tenant-friendly lease and the landlord-friendly lease. If you want to know, then stick around. Now, if you are thinking about buying a commercial property, one of the important things that for you to understand is that commercial property lease. Now, commercial property lease can be a tenant-friendly lease. It can be a landlord-friendly lease. Now, what are the things that you need to look into to determine that it is a landlord-friendly lease? All right. So now let me talk about residential property lease for a moment, right? If you own a residential property, you know that the residential property lease is always tenant-friendly lease. The reason behind that, it's a mass population who are the renters in Australia, and they actually have to be protected by the government. I mean, I'm not saying in a bad way, but the government is their responsibility to make sure that every citizen is being taken care of, and hence they have created a kind of a rule book, or what is called RTA, Residential Tenancy Act, where there's been clearly rules that have been given against the favor of the tenant, because there are so many landlords, there are way too many tenants, and it's government is responsibility to make sure that their tenants are protected, right? So in general, all the leases in residential property follows this Residential Tenancy Act, and if you read through that act, you would agree with me that it is mostly in tenants' favor, which means a residential lease always a tenant friendly lease. It is almost impossible in Australia to make a residential lease as landlord friendly lease. Why? Because, for example, the bond payment, you can only charge up to 4 weeks of bond in residential tenancy or residential lease. You cannot charge 6 weeks. You cannot say 8 weeks I need and all sort of things. It's not possible. Now, coming back to the commercial property, this lease can be a tenant friendly, can be a landlord friendly. As a owner, as a landowner, you need to dictate what you want to be. Of course, as a landlord, you would always ask for making a landlord friendly lease. That's because there is not much government interference on these commercial leases. It's been drawn up by lawyers and generally by the landlord lawyer, and then landlord is going to put, okay, I want these, and if you agree, then I will give the tenancy, otherwise I will not. So there is no clear mandate, which is why it can be landlord friendly. For example, you could ask, instead of 4 weeks bond, a 6 months bond in commercial property. Now, if you only ask for no bond, then it becomes tenant friendly lease because they don't have much skin in the game. But in commercial, if you ask for 6 months bond or 6 months security deposit or the bank guarantee, then what happens is that 6 months worth of rent is secured. And if you take that as a security deposit, that money, depends on which state, can come to your bank account, and you can keep in your bank and you can get that interest of that money as well. So this is a clear indication of whether it's a tenant friendly lease or the landlord friendly lease. Now, another point whether it determines is a tenant friendly or landlord friendly is what is called make good clause. Make good clause is basically saying that, okay, if I'm giving you tenancy, I'm giving you an empty shop, but you are going to do a fit out, you are going to spend, but at the end you need to fix these things, you need to repatch, repaint, and give the original conditions. And that clause, if you put together, then it become a landlord friendly lease, because hey, tenant has, at the end of the tenancy, if they move out, and when they will move out, they need to give you the original condition. They can't just leave like this and go. That will have that other repercussion. So that is another example of making a landlord friendly lease. Now, there are so many other conditions that you can put it, but the fundamental difference is with residential tenancy, it is always a tenant friendly lease, and with commercial, there is always a provision to make it as a landlord friendly lease. Now, the third one that you can put together is that you want rent is always in advance. 2 months in advance, 3 months in advance, you could ask for it. And as a tenant, once they agree, they need to pay that. So you'll send the invoice 2 months in advance, and they will pay the rent 2 months in advance. If you say that that rent is going to pay at the end of the month, then it is becoming more and more into tenant friendly lease. If you ask for advance, then it is becoming more and more landlord friendly lease. So in a nutshell, what you need to look into is that when you are providing this lease or you're creating this lease, you dictate, you tell your lawyer, then draft the lease according to these criteria, according to this, and make sure you put all these things clause. And remember, as I said, that there is not much government interference. As long as there are some interference, I would say there are some guidelines, but as long as you follow those guidelines, but there is no clear mandate or clear kind of rules that, oh, you cannot do this, you cannot do that. For example, in commercial property, that if you have a big shop, you can create two tenancies and give these two separately by putting a wall, and then that is not possible in residential property. Again, that comes to the lease, so you can break that lease into two smaller leases in commercial property. That is not possible into residential property. In fact, residential property, like one property, one lease. In commercial property, one property can be 10 different leases. So that again goes back to that it's a landlord friendly lease, it's not much tenant friendly lease. I hope you got some idea about why people invest into commercial property and what's the difference between tenant friendly lease and the landlord friendly lease. There are so many other rules also that you can include, you can put together and make it more and more landlord friendly lease. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.